Now, high street restaurant chains will be forced to hand over tips to their staff under new government plans. The Prime Minister wants to introduce new laws to stop employers making deductions from money left for workers by customers. In recent years, some restaurants have come under fire for unions for deducting up to 10% of tips in administration fees. Dave Turnbull is a regional officer for the Unite Union and has been campaigning for fairer tipping rules. Jay Rayner is a restaurant critic who thinks tips are outdated, and Kate Nichols is chief executive of the trade association Hospitality UK and also joins us representing the restaurants. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. OK, Jay Rayner, what do you think then? You think tips are not the right thing anyway?
Look, first of all, clarity is a useful thing. I've been writing about restaurants for 19 years, and even I get confused as to where the money's going and what's happening to it. Some form of clarity, even if the Tories have nixed this policy of Labour, who announced it, a few months back. Some sort of clarity is a marvellous, marvellous thing. But in the long term, I find the idea that people working in restaurants are dependent on a reasonable income, on the caprices of their customers, really rather demeaning. You're not going to get an extra £5 off the editor today for doing a rather good job. I'd much prefer it if all service charges were wrapped up in the cost of a meal. It would mean that the headline prices would go up, but at least you would know that the people serving you are on a reasonable wage and all the confusion would go away.
Kate Nichols, what do you think? The government now saying that there will be new laws to stop employers taking money away from the tips.
Well, we don't think new laws are necessarily the right answer. This issue first came up in consultation with government 2-3 years ago, and as a result of that, the industry did put its house in order. Jay's absolutely right. This is about transparency. This is about making sure that customers and the teams that work with us know exactly what happens to their tips and where it goes. And as a result of government concerns 2 years ago, we put in place a self-regulatory code of practice together with Unite to address this issue, and we feel that that's a better way of taking it forward, where we won't have any unforeseen consequences rather than a blunt instrument of legislation.
Dave Turnbull, how do you see it?
Well, Kate's right. We did draw up this code of practice, but we don't think that necessarily addresses the issue. And I would agree with Jay, there does need to be clarity, because the problem is different restaurants have different policies and different interpretations. So we've been through quite a challenging time recently with TGI Fridays and whether or not they comply with the code we've agreed with the employers. So we welcome the announcement that there's going to be legislation.
So just to explain again, because it is really confusing, a service charge means something quite different from a tip, is that right?
Well, to simplify it so that everybody understands, a service charge or any money you leave on a credit card or debit card technically, legally belongs to the employer until they decide what's going to happen to it. And that's where we find a lot of the problems arise. And
so will the government proposals make a difference to that?
Well, if the government proposal is that 100% of tips and service charge should go to staff, then that would address that issue, because there would be no reason for an employer to be taking any money out of that. But obviously we've yet to see the detail and yet to analyse exactly what it is the government are proposing.
How does it work? Do restaurants kind of use the money that comes in as tips and service charge to effectively get around minimum wage, so it supplements and it's sort of a movable feast? I mean, just explain from your perspective.
It used to be lawful for employers to use tips to contribute towards the minimum wage.
Right.
But we campaigned against that, and the law was changed in 2009 by the last Labour government. So that's no longer lawful. Okay. So what kind of happens is exactly as Jay said. There's a low pay economy within the restaurants where everybody is paid minimum wage and then relies on tips to make a living wage. So we would support the notion that staff deserve a living wage, and it's really down to the customer to decide if they leave a tip.
Kate, you wanted to come in.
I was going to come in there and say, there is no question here about restaurants trying to undercut wages or trying to subsidise wages with tips. Tips very much remain a reward for good service. It's right that that good service can be shared amongst the whole team, and not just with the waiter, because its service is made up by a whole team delivering it. This is not a question of poor pay. The sector is paying above national living wage and above national minimum wage when we look at the
that's not the case.
sector. And tips are coming in and supplementing income and providing a top-up where people are rewarding good service. What we don't want to see is
I want to let Jay come in.
across that.
Firstly, we know that there are restaurants and operators all over the country who are not paying a reasonable wage. But the idea, to go back to this thing of rewarding good service, that it's all dependent on mood and, any number of different factors, it doesn't happen in 98% of our economy. Why should the restaurant business be any different? Just make sure that they're being paid a proper wage so the diner isn't being confused as well.
It's not voluntary, though, anyway, is it, when you get 10% or whatever it is addition to the bill at the end as a service charge?
I say, having done this job for so many years, I get confused between, service charge, voluntary service charge already added to the bill, the idea of what happens if you put cash on the table. It is incredibly confusing. And actually, the government's announcement, which I have to say, they've had very little domestic policy, and if this is all they've got, it's rather tragic. They've not exactly given us any clarity on this, and I wish them well wading into the complexities of the trunk system, because it has destroyed lesser people than them.
Can I just say that, the service charge is voluntary, an additional tip is voluntary, and there is already a requirement, and has been since 2009, for restaurants to make clear what happens to that money. And this is all about transparency for the workers and the customers, and they can make a decision as to how they want to proceed on the basis of that.
Thank you all very much. We have had lots of people getting in touch on this one. Scott on email: tips are a great excuse for business owners to pay their staff less. I'd love to see an end to a tipping culture and a move towards genuine gratitude with words. That would have a longer positive impact on the customer and the employee. Peter on email: simple. Staff should be paid a decent wage. None of the chefs or the managers would accept paying their mortgage by relying on tips. Rachel on Twitter: tipping is an excuse not to pay decent wages. Workers in the hospitality industry should be paid enough not to rely on tips. It's appalling in the US, and it would be appalling to accept it here. As a nation, we need to stop propping up businesses for bosses who pay badly. Harry and Jenny on email: just returned from a great holiday in the USA. Despite being pre-warned, we were dismayed at the tip culture there. Speaking to concierge and staff, it appears there may be moves to ban it and make it voluntary. Tips should be for good service. Employers here in USA should be made to pay higher wages and definitely not deduct any percentage for admin. Sean on text: removing tipping altogether will just reduce good service, as waiters will no longer be over-accommodating in the hope of a good tip, and instead just do the basics, knowing they have no incentive to treat customers well. It's great to have that range of views and your views as well. Thank you very much.